My name is Anna Spooner and I'm absolutely thrilled that you've joined me here today from my cellar in France to begin or to continue your wine education journey. Now, I am a WSET qualified educator and I've finished all my WSET exams and I'm on the Master of Wine programme at stage 2. However, my background hasn't always been in wine education. I was also a writer working for some newspapers and major magazines in the UK. I've also taught at wine schools, but more recently I was a tasting coordinator at a famous retailer in the UK, hosting tastings for people just like you who want to learn a little bit about wine but don't necessarily want the hassle or the stress of taking wine exams. And to be honest, I don't blame you. It has a little tendency to suck some of the life and the joy out of learning about wine. So I'm really thrilled that you've joined me here today to learn casually, but also to get that light education so you can feel really confident when you open up your wine list or you go into your supermarket. You know a little bit about what you're talking about, and that will make you enjoy wine infinitely more, I promise. So if you're tasting along with me, that's fantastic. I recognise you might be on the tube or listening in the car. You might have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. That's also fine. But if you are tasting along, I guarantee you're going to get a lot more enjoyment out of these videos. So I hope you've got a large glass and cheers. If you're new to wine tasting, then hopefully you'll find this video useful. Personally, I often remind myself how to taste like a professional because, okay, I'm not using it everywhere I go. I'm not using this technique in a restaurant with my husband. I think he'd be horrified. And I'm also not using this technique, when I'm opening an everyday wine at home. But when I'm trying to understand why I really like a wine as much as I do, or to get maximum enjoyment out of that really special bottle that I've opened at home, this technique gives me loads of tools to be able to better understand and then better enjoy the wine. So we're here in the cellar and it's not the easiest place. It's nice and brightly lit, which is very helpful when you're looking at wine. You might want, and if you're taking it very seriously, you might want to have a white surface to look at your wine. It's the first port of call when we're talking about wine tasting. Might sound a bit weird, but before we even get on to tasting, we're going to look at the wine and we're going to smell it. Don't take the part about the looking too seriously. The reality is there's lots of things at play when you're looking at the colour of a wine. So yes, okay, my red wine might look a bit brown. Oh, it must be old. Well, not necessarily. There are great varieties that have different levels of certain colours. Some are browner than others, some are bluer than others. So you have to take looking at the wine with a pinch of salt. But if you do want to look at the wine, the best thing to do is hold it at 45 degrees. You have your lovely white paper if you're taking yourself seriously. Look into the bowl of the body of the wine. That's going to give you the depth. How dense is that colour? It will give you some indication possibly about the style of wine. The deeper the colour, often the richer things like tannins are. Don't worry, I'll talk about those in a minute. But you might also want to look at the rim of a wine. Generally, a paler rim might mean on a red wine that it's aged a little bit, but again, it can mean all sorts of things. So don't get too hung up on how the wine looks. The next bit certainly makes you look professional, but it also does serve a purpose as well, and that's to swirl the wine. So I've got over a decade of swirling under my belt, so I'm more than happy doing this, although actually if you asked me to do it on my left hand, I'd make a serious mess. If you're worried about making a mess, then the first thing that I learnt to do was to put the glass down on a table, put the fingers over the top of the base of the glass and turn it. And when you do that, you're going to start to understand the motion. Makes a horrible noise, apologies. But once you've done that, you can graduate slowly into swirling your glass. Now, like I said, makes you look very pro, but it does also serve a purpose as well. it's adding a bit of oxygen, it's aerating your wine, and it's allowing those aromas to really express themselves, because the next stage of your wine tasting is going to be to smell the wine. There is no point in swirling your wine beautifully and then smelling it a foot away. You really have to get your nose into that glass. I've been known to come out of a wine tasting with some red wine on the bridge of my nose, and I don't mind. It means I've really got stuck in. It's important to give a slow, even smell with your nose right on in there, and that's going to give you the best interpretation possible of what you can gather from the glass. So as a demonstration, so I had a nice slow smell in, and I started to think about what aromas I might be getting. There's fruit. Now you might say, oh, it smells like grapes. There's not actually very many wines that smell of grapes. There are a few, but you should get a bit more creative with your fruits. Is it citrus fruits? Is it fruits that you find in an orchard, like peaches and apples? Is it berries? I've got a Rioja here and it's packed full of berry fruit flavours. I've also got some plums as well. So plums from the orchard. I've got raspberries, I've got strawberries. They're fantastic and they're really, really expressive. But it doesn't just have to be fruit. I've also got, from the oak used in my Rioja, some spices. So a bit of cinnamon, a bit of clove, and that is directly from the winemaking process. So in the wine world, we call that secondary characteristics. Your fruit flavours are your primaries, your secondary notes are things from the winemaking, and then lastly there's something called tertiary, so the third element, and that's to do with how old the wine is. There might be no tertiary characters, that means the wine's probably young. This wine is nearly 10 years old, and I'm already getting a slightly leather, slightly tobacco leaf, but almost meaty as well characteristic. And that is from the age of the wine, so that's tertiary. There's a little handout with some inspiration on certain aromas that you might pick up. I would say practice, practice, practice. Not just practicing with wine, you can also just practice smelling things. Next time you eat a raspberry, take a good smell of it first. Next time you go into your spice drawer, open up cinnamon, remind yourself what it smells like. When you're sat tasting wine amongst friends and somebody says, oh, I really think that smells like kumquats, and you go, oh my gosh, I can't even remember what that smells like. It's not because you can't smell a kumquat, it's because you probably haven't done so for a while. Memory and smell are so interlinked, and so if you just keep practicing, you will find it much, much easier to pick up the aromas when you pick up your glass. Then the last part of all of this is the bit that we all enjoy, the tasting. Now for this, I've actually got a mug. You could use a spittoon, anything would do. I've brought a lovely little mug with some wine bottles on it. I find there's always a mug to hand and you can easily grab one to spit your wine into. Of course, you don't even have to spit your wine. I'm doing it because if I tasted 100 wines a day and didn't spit, I'd be very unwell and I certainly wouldn't be able to make any videos. But if you're just enjoying a glass with friends, don't feel obliged to spit it out. Enjoy it. The technique for tasting wine is not the prettiest, and that's why I don't encourage you doing it in your restaurants, and certainly if you're just enjoying it, if you're enjoying it with someone you're trying to impress, perhaps keep it a little more subtle. What you're going to do is swirl the wine around your mouth, and that's so that you can get as much contact as possible with wine to this whole surface area of your mouth. Don't do it too aggressively, you don't need to, just a gentle swirl will do. It's not mouthwash after all, but a gentle rotation of the wine around the mouth is perfect. The second part is the really interesting bit. It's the Hannibal Lecter moment. I purse my lips. You don't have to. You can keep a straight face if you want to. I always worry I'm going to spit wine. Usually I'm talking about the wine at the same time, which is a challenge. But you want to bring in a little bit of oxygen into your mouth. What you're actually doing is you're getting a bit of oxygen to come up here and through the nose, and you're allowing taste and smell to sort of meld and combine to give you the maximum understanding of the wine. But it's not pretty. So I'm going to do a demonstration for you. And if you are tasting along, perhaps don't try this first time with a red wine. Maybe maybe try with a white wine, and definitely don't try this on a cream carpet. So, it's definitely not the easiest thing to do, but a bit of practice will make perfect. What it's done for my ability to taste the wine is I can now feel tannins. Tannins are the drying sensation, a little bit like drinking an old cup of tea. I can feel tannins all over the roof of my mouth. I've got a little bit on my tongue as well. Those are something, they come from the grape itself, and you usually get them in red wine. That's the drying sensation. When someone says, I want a dry wine, that is not what they mean. Dry is actually a word that you use to describe how sweet the wine is. Now, most table wines, so most wines that we're just ordering at a restaurant with dinner or picking up off the shelf of the supermarket, those are more likely to be dry. Really unlikely you're grabbing a sweet wine by accident. But dry just means the absence of sugar. You can then have medium dry, medium sweet, and sweet. You can kind of follow this sweetness scale up. And of course, if you're really into your sweet wine, it becomes very important how sweet that sweetness is. But for the vast majority of wines you're going to be tasting, chances are they're already dry. So one tip to maybe not sound silly amongst wine professionals is don't say, oh, this wine is very dry. Chances are it's definitely dry and everybody knows it. The next tip is the acidity. So I've already had the drying sensation in my mouth, which is the tannins. That's mainly for red. But what you get across all wines is the amount of acidity. Now that doesn't mean how much does my wine taste like lemon juice, although naturally that's going to increase your perception of acidity. But actually what acidity means is how much is my mouth watering. I find it really hard to talk about acidity and not salivate. It's always the bit when I'm teaching people about wine that I start foaming at the mouth. But acidity is the perfect counterbalance to tannins. So really, really great wines will have the perfect equilibrium of whatever your perfect equilibrium is, of that drying sensation if it's a red, but always with the right amount of that acidity. Now that doesn't mean that a low acidity wine is a bad wine, and personal preference will dictate how acidic you like your wines. I personally love that really racy high acidity you get from grape varieties like Riesling, where your mouth is completely salivating and you want to have food with it. For me, that's my personal preference, but not everybody likes that. It can be quite intense, that experience. So again, we tend to talk about low, medium and high acidity wines, just like we do with tannins, low, medium and high. And that's really all you need to know about the structure, other than the final piece, which is the body. And body is kind of a bit of an amalgamation of all of those things. So you can have light-bodied wines, medium-bodied wines and full-bodied wines. Full-bodied wines tend to be those wines that have high tannins, they might be higher in alcohol, they might have a real roundness and richness to them, and often those will have high acidity as well. The body is really just how does the wine feel in your mouth. There's many sort of examples and things that you can draw parallels with. One is milk. Is it skimmed, semi-skimmed, full fat? I've also heard beer examples, I've heard coffee examples, but I think the milk one works well. It's not necessarily about whether the flavour is any stronger, it's just about how you feel the wine in your mouth. And then I suppose, last but not least, you do have to talk about the flavours. Hopefully lots of the similar flavours that you picked up when you smelt the wine will appear in the taste of wine. But so long as you can taste something when you try your wine, it's really important. For me, there's no perfect wine. So by all means, you can start to write out what your personal preferences are. Perhaps you say, I like lower tannin wines, like a lighter style of Pinot Noir, perhaps for the reds. You might say, like me, I love high acid whites. You might say, I like sweet whites. Don't discount other wines of the world. Remember, these are all parameters. They're scales. They can go up and down. The most important thing about a good quality wine is to make sure the wine is in balance. I mentioned it earlier and I'll mention it again. So long as you come away feeling like you've had a whole package with your wine, then you can't really go wrong. So if you're practicing tasting along with me, pour yourself a little more wine and give it another go.